The translation device in my ear was still calibrating when I saw the first warship through the viewport. It was not one of ours. Nothing humans had ever built looked like that, a crescent of dark metal nearly 2 kilometers long, drifting beside the conclave station with the lazy patience of something that had never needed to hurry in its existence. I counted 11 more behind it before I stopped counting. My name is Dominic Hale, and in approximately 6 hours, I was going to do something that no representative of any species had done in 12,000 years of galactic civilization. I just did not know it yet. The station itself defied every sense of scale I had trained myself to understand. Conclave Station was not a structure in any way that word applied to human engineering. It was closer to a captured asteroid that someone had hollowed out, polished, and filled with the governmental machinery of 400 spacefaring civilizations. It orbited a dead star in a system that belonged to no one, which was supposedly the point. Neutral ground, sacred ground, the kind of ground where history got made whether you wanted it to or not. I adjusted the collar of my diplomatic uniform and turned away from the viewport. Behind me, Commander Laura Beckett stood with her arms crossed and her jaw tight. She was the captain of the Carthage, the frigate that had carried me across 47 light-years to attend what the Galactic Council called the Ascension Dialogue. Humanity had waited 19 years for this invitation. 19 years of first contact protocols, cultural exchanges, limited trade agreements, and careful diplomatic maneuvering, all building toward this single event. "You look like you are about to walk into a firing squad," Beckett said. "I am about to walk into a negotiation with 400 alien species who have been doing this longer than human civilization has existed," I said. "So yes, essentially a firing squad." She almost smiled. Almost. The docking clamps engaged with a deep resonant hum that I felt in my chest. A delegation was already waiting on the other side of the airlock. The Valith were tall, translucent-skinned insectoids who served as the Council's protocol officers. They moved with the practiced elegance of creatures who had been welcoming newcomers to this station for millennia. Their lead representative, a being whose name translated roughly to orchestrator of courtesies, bowed in a gesture I had been briefed was reserved for species attending their first Ascension Dialogue. "Ambassador Hale," the orchestrator said through my translation device, "the Galactic Council welcomes humanity to the threshold of belonging. You carry the hopes of your world. We carry the traditions of the many who came before you." I returned the bow at the precise angle my cultural advisors had drilled into me. "Humanity is honored by the invitation. We look forward to meaningful dialogue." The words tasted like rehearsal. They were rehearsal. Every syllable had been approved by a committee back on Earth. They led me through corridors that belonged in a cathedral, not a government building. Crystalline walls displayed holographic monuments to every species that had undergone the ascension process. Hundreds of civilizations, their emblems and founding moments preserved in light. I was meant to feel humbled. I was meant to feel the weight of tradition pressing down on my shoulders and making me compliant. I noted that it was working. Then something happened that my briefing documents had not prepared me for. A small figure bumped against my left side as we passed through a crowded junction. 4 arms. Damp, greenish skin. Amphibian features pulled tight with what I recognized immediately as fear, because fear looks the same on every face I have ever seen, regardless of how many eyes that face has. The Rithon attaché pressed something into my palm without looking at me. A data chip, small enough to close my fingers around without anyone noticing. Then the figure was gone, absorbed into the crowd like a stone dropped into dark water. I kept walking. I kept my expression neutral. I slipped the chip into my pocket and followed the Valith delegation deeper into the station. The council chamber was the single largest enclosed space I had ever entered. Tiered seating rose in concentric rings around a central platform, and every tier was occupied. 400 species. 400 sets of sensory organs focused on the lone human standing at the bottom of that vast amphitheater. Some I recognized from briefings. The Draith were impossible to miss. Massive reptilian beings seated in reinforced sections that could support their bulk. The Orani were clustered in a block, their bioluminescent markings pulsing in synchronized patterns that suggested constant silent communication among themselves. Dozens more I could not identify, all watching. The High Arbiter descended to the central platform from an elevated position that I suspected was deliberately designed to force every other being in the chamber to look upward at him. Siolunket was old, even by Draeth standards. His scales had gone from dark green to a mottled gray that spoke of centuries. When he spoke, the translation device rendered his voice as something deep and smooth and impossibly confident. "Humanity," Siolunket said, and the single word filled the chamber. "You have crossed the threshold that separates the young from the enduring. You have proven your capacity for reason, for cooperation, and for the restraint that civilization demands. Today, the Galactic Council extends to you the Ascension Dialogue, that you may take your place among the family of spacefaring peoples." He gestured, and a luminous tablet materialized on the podium before me. The Ascension Treaty. 700 pages of dense text in Galactic Common. "You will have the honor of reviewing the treaty tonight," the High Arbiter continued. "Tomorrow, negotiations will begin. The Council looks forward to welcoming Earth into the fold." Applause. Or whatever the equivalent was across 400 species. Rhythmic sounds, flashing bioluminescence, vibrations I could feel through the floor. I smiled and inclined my head and said the appropriate words of gratitude. But I was watching their faces, all of them. And what I saw was not curiosity, it was not warmth. It was the particular expression of an audience that already knows the ending of the play they are watching. They were not waiting to see what humanity would negotiate. They were waiting to see how long it would take us to believe we had won. I returned to my quarters with the treaty tablet and the data chip and a feeling in my gut that had kept me alive through 3 diplomatic postings in conflict zones back on Earth. The feeling that said the room was wrong, the smiles were wrong, the hospitality was wrong. I locked the door. I activated the counter-surveillance suite that our intelligence division had built into my luggage. Then I opened the data chip. It took me 40 minutes to understand what I was looking at. Fragments of older treaties, redacted sections that someone had painstakingly reconstructed. Clauses buried so deep in procedural language that no translator would flag them without specific instructions to look. I pulled up the treaty that had been presented to humanity and laid them side by side on my display. My hands went cold. The Ascension Treaty was not a negotiation framework. It was a script. The same script, rewritten with minor cosmetic variations, that had been used on every single species for 12,000 years. The concessions, that each new species believed they had won through hard bargaining, were pre-written. They existed in the template before the species in question had even achieved spaceflight. The negotiation was theater. Elaborate, patient, meticulous theater, designed to make each new civilization believe it had fought for and secured favorable terms. And the terms themselves, once I stripped away the procedural camouflage, were devastating. Independent military capability would be capped and then gradually reduced over 3 centuries. Territorial expansion would require council approval, which historical records showed was never granted. Resource extraction rights on a species' own worlds would be transferred to a cooperative management framework that was controlled entirely by council-appointed administrators. Political autonomy would be maintained in name while every meaningful decision would require ratification by bodies where elder species held permanent majorities. It was not a treaty, it was a cage built out of language, and every species in that chamber was already inside it. I sat in the dark of my quarters for a long time. I thought about the 19 years of work that had brought me here. I thought about the committees and the politicians, and the billions of people on Earth who were watching this moment with hope. I thought about what would happen if I signed. And I thought about the Rithon attaché, with the fear on his face, pressing a chip into a stranger's hand, because he had no other way to scream. I did not sleep that night. When morning came, I dressed in my formal diplomatic blacks. I walked through the crystalline corridors one more time, past the monuments to ascended species that I now understood were not celebrations but tombstones. I entered the negotiation chamber. 400 species turned their attention to me. The High Arbiter invited me to present humanity's opening position. I stood at the podium. I looked at the treaty tablet. I looked at the faces watching me with that patient, knowing expression. "Earth declines to negotiate," I said. The silence lasted 3 full seconds. I counted them. 3 seconds in which 400 species tried to process a sentence that their entire political framework had no mechanism to understand. Then the chamber erupted, and the sound hit me like a physical wall. No species in 12,000 years had ever refused the Ascension dialogue. No species had ever stood at that podium and said no. The word itself seemed to break something in the room. Some fundamental assumption that the Council had operated on for so long that it had become invisible to them. The High Arbiter stared at me with an expression I could not read. His mouth opened and closed twice before he spoke. "Ambassador Hale," he said, and for the first time, his voice carried something other than absolute confidence. "Perhaps you do not understand the significance of what has been offered." "I understand it perfectly," I said. "That is why I am declining." I turned and walked out of the chamber with 400 voices rising behind me, and the data chip resting in my pocket like a grenade, with the pin already pulled. I had just made humanity the most dangerous species in the galaxy. I just was not sure yet whether that would save us or destroy us. The armed escort appeared within 90 seconds of my exit from the chamber. 4 Valith security officers, each carrying weapons that my briefing materials identified as neural disruptors, fell into formation around me without a word. Their leader, a Valith whose translucent skin was flushed with agitated purple, told me I was being escorted to my quarters for my own protection. I noticed she did not specify who I needed protection from. The corridor behind me was filling with noise. I could hear it even through the thick walls of Conclave Station, the sound of 400 diplomatic delegations simultaneously losing their composure. It was not a sound the station had been designed to contain, because the station's architects had never imagined it would need to. My quarters had been transformed in my absence. The decorative elements were gone. The welcoming flowers, or whatever the alien equivalent had been removed. My communication terminal was active, and the incoming message queue was already overflowing. I counted 47 priority transmissions in the first 10 seconds. Earth, the Valith Protocol Office, the Orani Syndicate, the Drathith Military Liaison, a dozen delegations I had never communicated with directly, all demanding the same thing, an explanation. I ignored every single one of them. Instead, I sat down at my terminal and began organizing the data from the chip into a coherent presentation. If the next few hours went the way I expected, I would need evidence that could withstand scrutiny from beings who had been practicing law and diplomacy since before humans had figured out agriculture. The first envoy arrived within the hour. The Orani Syndicate sent 3 representatives, their bioluminescent markings pulsing in careful synchronization that my cultural database identified as formal concern. They were traders, the Orani. Commerce was their civilization's defining practice, and they had embedded themselves so deeply into galactic economic infrastructure that nearly every trade route of significance passed through their networks. Their lead negotiator, a tall being with patterns of gold light rippling across dark blue skin, sat across from me and laid out humanity's economic future with clinical precision. Without Ascension, Earth would have no access to galactic trade networks, no technology exchanges, no resource markets. Human goods would be worthless, beyond our own solar system, because we would have no certification standards, no trade agreements, no legal standing to participate in interstellar commerce. Within a generation, Earth would stagnate. Within 3, we would be irrelevant. A backwater species on a single world, watching the galaxy move on without us. "Ambassador Hale," the lead negotiator said, "your species has remarkable potential. It would be a tragedy to see that potential wasted over a misunderstanding." "There has been no misunderstanding," I said. "Then perhaps there has been a miscommunication. The Ascension dialogue is flexible. The Council is prepared to be generous." "I have read the treaty," I said. "I have also read the treaties of the species who came before us. The Council's generosity has been remarkably consistent." The gold light patterns on the Orani's skin froze for just a moment. Then they resumed, slightly faster than before. The delegation left without another word. The second envoy was not as polite. A Drathith military advisor arrived with 2 armed guards and a demeanor that made no effort to disguise the purpose of his visit. He was smaller than the High Arbiter, but built with the dense musculature of a species designed for conflict. His name was Grand Torvek, and he held the rank of Fleet Sovereign, which my database told me was roughly equivalent to a 4-star admiral. "Ambassador Hale," Grand Torvek said, and the translation device rendered his voice as gravel scraping against metal. "I am here to discuss the strategic realities of your situation." "I appreciate directness," I said. "Then I will be direct. Unascended species have no protection under galactic law. Your system has no defensive treaty. Your shipping lanes are unguarded. Your colonies, should you attempt to establish any, would have no legal standing. The galaxy is not a safe place for the unprotected, Ambassador. I am sure you understand what I mean." I understood exactly what he meant. He was telling me that without signing the Ascension Treaty, humanity would be a target for anyone who wanted what we had, and faced no legal consequences for taking it. "I appreciate the warning," I said. "Earth declines to negotiate." Grand Torvek studied me for a long moment. I had the distinct impression of being evaluated by something that had spent its entire career calculating the cost of military action versus the cost of patience. Then he stood, his massive frame blocking the light from the ceiling, and left my quarters without another word. The silence after his departure was heavier than the silence before his arrival. I was sitting alone, reviewing the data chip's contents for the 4th time, when my proximity alert chimed. Someone was at my door, but they had not announced themselves through official channels. I opened it to find the Rithon attaché standing in the corridor, with the look of a creature who expected to be caught and punished at any moment. "Come in," I said. "Quickly." He moved fast for a being with 4 arms, and a body built for aquatic environments. Once inside, he stood in the corner farthest from the door and wrapped 2 of his arms around himself, in what I interpreted as a self-comforting gesture. "My name is Saval," he said. His voice through the translator was thin and shaking. "I gave you the chip." "I know," I said. "Sit down. Tell me why." Saval did not sit. He paced, which for a Rithon involved a kind of swaying shuffle that made him look like he was always about to fall over. But his words were precise, and the story he told me was the kind of story that changes the way you see everything. The Rithon were among the first species to undergo ascension. Nearly 9,000 years ago, they had been a dominant force in their region of space. A powerful fleet, a thriving culture, a civilization that had begun to explore the philosophical questions that come with interstellar capability. Then the Galactic Council, which was much smaller then, had approached them with the Ascension dialogue. The Rithon had negotiated fiercely, or so their historical records said. They had won concessions. They had signed the treaty believing they had secured their sovereignty. Within 500 years, their fleet had been decommissioned. Within 1,000, their territorial holdings had been absorbed into council-managed zones. Their homeworld's resources were administered by an off-world board. Their representatives served as translators, clerks, and protocol officers. Not because they had been conquered, but because the treaty they had signed, the treaty they had believed was a fair compromise, had been engineered from the beginning to produce exactly that outcome. 9,000 years, Saval said, and his forearms tightened around his body. "We have been inside the machine for 9,000 years, and we did not see the walls until you refused to enter." I let that sit in the air between us. Then I asked the question that mattered. Why me? Why now? You could have given that chip to any species that came through the ascension process. Saval looked at me with eyes that were entirely black and entirely unreadable. "We have tried," he said. 3 times in the last 2,000 years, we approached new species with evidence. Every time, they signed the treaty anyway. They could not believe that a system this old, this established, this respected, could be built on deception. They thought we were lying, or jealous, or trying to manipulate them for our own advantage. "What makes you think humans will be different?" Saval was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that I have never forgotten. "Because you already said no, before you had proof, before you had allies, before you had any reason to believe you could survive the consequences. You stood in that chamber and said no, because something in you refused to be fooled. No species has ever done that." I wanted to tell him that I was not brave. I wanted to tell him that standing in that chamber and refusing the treaty had been the most terrifying moment of my life, and that my hands had not stopped shaking for an hour afterward. But that was not what he needed to hear. "What happens now?" I asked. That depends on your government. The Council will not let this stand. They will isolate you, threaten you, and if necessary, they will demonstrate what happens to species that refuse to comply. You need your homeworld behind you, Ambassador. Without that, you are just one person saying no, and one person can be silenced. After Saval left through a maintenance corridor that he had clearly used before, I sat at my terminal and composed the most important message of my life. I attached the full contents of the data chip along with my analysis. I encrypted it with every protocol our intelligence division had given me, and I sent it to the United Diplomatic Corps on Earth with a single line of text at the top. Read this, then tell me to sign. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling of my quarters on a station the size of a moon, surrounded by 400 civilizations that had been quietly subjugated by the very system they believed had elevated them. Earth was 47 light-years away. A response would take hours even through the fastest relay networks, and in those hours, the Council would be deciding how to deal with me. I had kicked a hornet's nest the size of a galaxy. All I could do now was wait and hope that when Earth's leadership read what I had sent them, they would see what I saw, because if they did not, they would recall me. They would send someone more cooperative, someone who would sit at that podium and negotiate in good faith with a system designed to swallow civilizations whole. And humanity would join the Rithanon, and the hundreds of other species who had walked willingly into a cage, so beautifully constructed that they had spent millennia calling it home. 3 days passed, and the Council pretended I did not exist. My official schedule was cleared. My requests for meetings were denied through automated systems that used language so polite, it circled back around to insulting. The Valith protocol officers still stood outside my quarters, but they no longer bothered with the pretense of protection. They were guards. I was being contained. But containment has limits when the thing you are trying to contain has already sent its message. On the morning of the 4th day, my display screen activated on its own and projected the Council's main broadcast channel into my quarters. The High Arbiter Siolun Ket stood at the center of the full assembly, and this time, there was no warmth in his performance, no welcoming platitudes. His gray-scaled face was arranged in an expression of judicial severity that he had clearly practiced in front of whatever mirror his species used. Fellow members of the Galactic Council, Siolun Ket began, it is my duty to address the disruption caused by the human delegation's unprecedented refusal to engage in the Ascension dialogue. After careful deliberation, the Council has concluded that this refusal reflects a fundamental developmental immaturity on the part of the human species. Earth has demonstrated that it is not yet prepared for the responsibilities of galactic society. I leaned forward. Here it came. Therefore, I am proposing a quarantine resolution. Effective upon ratification, all contact with Earth and its territories will be severed. All trade routes to human-controlled space will be closed. All diplomatic channels will be suspended. This quarantine will remain in effect until such time as humanity demonstrates the maturity required to participate in the ascension process as designed. He paused, and I watched the chamber. 400 delegations, many of whom had spent the last 3 days whispering among themselves about what my refusal might mean, went very still. Because the quarantine resolution was not about humanity, every being in that chamber understood the real message. Refuse, and you will be erased. Refuse, and we will make you invisible. Refuse, and no one will remember you were ever here. The vote was scheduled for the following day. I stood up from my chair and sent a formal request through the Council's communication system. I requested an audience before the full assembly, not to negotiate, not to appeal, to speak. The response came within minutes. The High Arbiter, clearly confident that isolation and the threat of quarantine had broken me, granted the request. I suspect he expected me to walk into that chamber and capitulate with whatever dignity I had left. I suspect he had seen it before, probably dozens of times across his long career. The pattern was too old, too reliable, too deeply embedded in the Council's operating assumptions to account for the possibility that a species might refuse, and then keep refusing. I spent the night preparing, not a speech, a presentation. The next morning I walked into the council chamber for the second time, and the difference from my first visit was stark. There were no ceremonial flourishes, no welcoming address. The Valith protocol officers did not bow. The delegates watched me with expressions ranging from hostility to open contempt to something I recognized in a few scattered faces as carefully hidden fascination. The High Arbiter stood at his elevated position and looked down at me with the patience of a being who believed this matter was already settled. "Ambassador Hale," he said, "the Council has graciously granted your request to address the Assembly. You may speak." I stepped to the central podium. I placed a portable projector on its surface, and then I did something that no Ascension candidate had ever done in the history of the Galactic Council. I put the evidence on display. The holographic projection filled the space above the podium, large enough for every delegation in the amphitheater to see clearly. 12 Ascension treaties, spanning 9,000 years, laid out side by side in galactic common. I had chosen carefully. 12 treaties from 12 different species, 12 different eras, 12 different regions of space. Each one supposedly the product of unique negotiations between the Council and a new civilization finding its place in galactic society. "Members of the Council," I said, keeping my voice steady and my tone neutral, "I want to show you something. This is not an accusation. This is not a provocation. This is a pattern." I highlighted the first clause in the first treaty. Then I highlighted the identical clause in the second treaty, and the third, and the fourth. 12 treaties, 12 supposedly unique negotiated outcomes, and the clause was word for word identical in every single one. I moved to the next clause, identical, and the next, and the next. "These concessions," I said, pointing to sections that had been flagged as hard-won victories in the historical records of their respective species, "exist in the template. They were written before any of these species made first contact with the Council. The negotiation that each species believed it was engaged in was not a negotiation. It was a guided path to a predetermined outcome." The chamber was silent. Not the explosive silence of my initial refusal, but a different kind of silence. The silence of beings who were watching the walls of their reality develop cracks. I walked through the structural architecture of the treaties. I showed how independent military capability was capped by language that sounded like compromise but functioned as a countdown to disarmament. I showed how territorial expansion rights were preserved in theory, while every mechanism for exercising those rights was placed under Council authority. I showed how resource management was gradually transferred from sovereign control to Council-appointed boards through a series of incremental steps, each one small enough to seem reasonable, that collectively amounted to complete economic subordination. I did not raise my voice. I did not make accusations. I did not editorialize. I simply laid out the data and let it speak for itself. Then I asked a single question. "How many of you remember what your species was before you signed?" The silence broke, but it did not break the way the High Arbiter expected. A delegate from the Mokuran, a heavy-gravity species whose representative was a broad, stone-colored being with a voice like a deep bell, stood up from the mid-tier seating. "I want to see our treaty," the Mokuran representative said, "the original, unredacted." Another voice from across the chamber, a Tessic elder, thin and ancient, with silver-white features that spoke of a very long life. "The Tessic delegation seconds this request. We wish to review our original Ascension Treaty." Then the Rothan delegation rose. All of them. Not just Saval, who stood at the back with his forearms pressed tight against his sides, but the senior Rithon representatives, who had spent the last 3 days carefully avoiding any contact with me. They did not speak. They did not need to. The act of standing was statement enough. I watched the High Arbiter's face. For the first time since I had arrived on Conclave Station, his composure cracked visibly. Not a large crack, not a dramatic collapse, but the kind of hairline fracture that appears in a structure just before it fails. "This session is suspended," Sayolun Ket said, and his voice carried a sharpness that had not been there before. "The human delegation's presentation is a provocation by an unascended primitive who lacks the standing to address this body on matters of Council procedure. The quarantine resolution vote will proceed as scheduled." Will you release the original treaties? I asked, my voice carrying clearly across the chamber, despite the rising noise from the delegations. The High Arbiter did not answer. He turned and ascended to his elevated position, and the session was formally closed. But the damage was done. I could see it in the faces of the delegates as they filed out of the chamber. Some looked angry, some looked confused. And some, a smaller number, but a significant one, looked like they had just seen something they could not unsee. The Orani Syndicate, who had threatened me with economic devastation 3 days earlier, left the chamber without making any public statement. Their bioluminescent patterns were flickering in an irregular pattern that my cultural database identified as internal disagreement. The Mokuran delegation clustered in the corridor outside and engaged in rapid conversation that my translator could not pick up from that distance. And the Tessic elder who had seconded the request for original treaties walked past me without looking at me, but as she passed, she pressed something into my hand. Another data chip. I was starting to see a pattern in more ways than one. The Council's response came swiftly and with force. Within 6 hours of my presentation, a Draith battle group, 7 warships built on a scale that made the Carthage look like a lifeboat, repositioned to the approach vectors near Conclave Station. They took up positions that my military training recognized instantly as an interdiction formation. Nothing was going in or out of this system without passing through their firing lanes. Grand Torvek contacted me directly. No intermediaries, no diplomatic language. "You have made a serious error, Ambassador," he said. "You have disrupted the most stable political system in galactic history. You have introduced chaos into an order that has maintained peace for 12,000 years. I am giving you one opportunity to withdraw your remarks, return to the Ascension dialogue, and allow this process to conclude, as it has always concluded." "And if I decline?" I asked. "Then Earth will be designated a hazard civilization under Council Security Protocol 7. The implications of that designation are not something I need to explain to you." "I think you should explain them," I said. "Because I am recording this conversation, and I intend to share it with every delegation on this station." The channel went dead. I transmitted the recording within the hour. Every delegation, every species, every communication channel I could access. The Draith's threat, unfiltered and undeniable, laid bare for 400 civilizations to hear. And then, finally, Earth responded. The message came through the priority relay with encryption so heavy, it took my terminal 3 minutes to decode. It was from the United Diplomatic Corps, and the tone was unlike anything I had received from them before. The fury was gone. The demands for explanation were gone. In their place was something I had not expected. Authorization. They had read the data chip. They had cross-referenced it with independent intelligence, gathered from 19 years of limited contact with galactic species. They had consulted with every relevant department, agency, and governmental body on Earth. And they had reached a conclusion that I felt in my chest like a second heartbeat. I was no longer negotiating Earth's ascension. I was authorized to set terms. I read the message 3 times to make sure I understood it. Then I read the classified annex that accompanied it, which contained strategic assessments, military readiness reports, and a single line from the Secretary General that I memorized on the spot. "Make them understand that humanity does not kneel." I closed my terminal. I stood at the viewport of my quarters and looked out at the Draith battle group, hovering in the darkness between stars, their running lights tracing patterns against the void. I had cracked a system that had operated without challenge for 12 millennia. The forces that maintained that system were gathering against me, and they had the firepower to turn Earth's solar system into a debris field. But they also had a problem they had never faced before. For the first time in 12,000 years, the species standing at the podium had not just refused to sign. It had shown the other species why they should not have signed either. I had lit a match in a room full of beings who had forgotten they were sitting on fuel. Now I had to make sure the fire burned in the right direction. I began with the Rithian. Saval arranged a meeting in a section of Conclave Station that his people had quietly maintained off the Council's surveillance grid for centuries. The fact that the Rithon, supposedly a species of clerks and translators, had managed to maintain hidden infrastructure on the Council's own station for that long told me everything I needed to know about how much untapped capability existed among the so-called ascended species. The room was small, poorly lit, and filled with equipment that hummed at frequencies I could feel in my teeth. Saval was there with two senior Rithon officials, whose names he did not share, and whose faces were drawn tight with the particular tension of beings who were risking everything they had on a bet they could not afford to lose. "The Council will move against you within days," Saval said. "The quarantine resolution is a formality. Once it passes, they will close every route to your system and wait for you to starve." "They will not wait for us to starve," I said. "They will make an example of us. Quarantine is the polite version. If that does not work, they will escalate." "Then what do you propose?" "I propose we give them too many targets to hit." I laid out what I had been working on since the presentation in the council chamber. Not a military strategy, not a diplomatic gambit in the traditional sense, something that the council's 12,000-year-old playbook had no counter for, because it had never needed one. A coalition. The Mokuran had reached out to me through back channels within hours of my presentation. Their species had once maintained a naval tradition that was legendary in their region of space. The Ascension Treaty had dismantled it piece by piece over 2,000 years, and the Mokuran had spent every one of those years watching their identity as a spacefaring warrior culture dissolve into bureaucratic compliance. They wanted answers. More importantly, they wanted options. The Tessic elder who had slipped me the second data chip had sent a follow-up communication through encrypted channels that Saval's network helped me decode. Her name was Tessara Vone, and she was older than she looked, which was saying something, given that she already looked ancient. She held a position in the Tessic archives, the most comprehensive historical repository of any species in the Council, and she had access to something that could change everything. The original, unredacted Ascension treaties. Not the 12 I had shown the Council. All of them, over 300 treaties spanning 12,000 years, each one containing the raw evidence of systematic deception on a scale that would be impossible to deny, dismiss, or explain away. "The archives are on the Tessic homeworld," I told Saval. "Accessing them means getting Tessara off this station, back to her planet, and into a facility that the Council may already be monitoring." "It means the Council will need to be distracted," Saval said. "Yes," I said. "It does." The coalition grew faster than I expected, and slower than I needed. The Mokuran committed fully, their representative meeting with me in Saval's hidden chamber, and pledging his species' support with a formal gesture that involved touching his forehead to the ground, which my cultural database told me was a Mokuran oath of alliance that had not been invoked in over 1,000 years. 3 smaller species whose names I struggled to pronounce joined within the next day, each one bringing grievances that had been accumulating for centuries. But for every species that joined, 2 more pulled back. The Council's propaganda machine was efficient and experienced. Broadcasts across the station emphasized the stability of the existing order, the prosperity it had brought, the peace it had maintained. The unspoken message underneath was constant. Do not listen to the humans. They are young. They are reckless. They will drag you into chaos. Then the Dreyth escalated again. A second battle group entered the system. 14 warships now, arranged in formations that my military advisors on the Carthage confirmed were not defensive. They were positioning for action. Simultaneously, Dreyth vessels began running what they called security exercises near human-controlled space, which meant that warships were jumping into systems where human colonies were being established and performing weapons tests within sensor range of civilian populations. Earth's fleet went to high alert. Commander Beckett contacted me directly. "Dominic, we have Dreyth cruisers running live fire drills 2 light hours from the Kepler colony. Our picket ships are holding position, but if those exercises move any closer, we will have to respond. And if we respond, this becomes a shooting war we cannot win." "Hold position," I said. "Do not fire unless fired upon. I need time." "How much time?" I did not have an answer for that. Grand Torvek contacted me one more time. This time, the conversation was different. The threats were gone. In their place was something I had not expected from the fleet sovereign of the Draeth hegemony. "I want you to know something," he said, his voice lower than I had heard it before. "Something that your data may not have shown you. I am listening." The Draeth were the first. Before the Council existed in its current form, before the ascension process was codified, there was a single species that agreed to serve as the enforcement arm of a new galactic order. That species was promised that their strength would be preserved, that their role would be honored, that they would be the guardians of civilization itself. He paused. I waited. "We were the prototype, Ambassador, the first species to be reshaped by the system you have exposed. Our military dominance is not natural. It was engineered. Our cultural identity as warriors and enforcers was not something we chose. It was designed for us. We were made into the Council's weapon so long ago that we have no memory of what we were before." "If you know this," I said carefully, "then why are you threatening to use that weapon against me?" "Because knowing what you are does not change what you are," Grand Torvek said. "I am a tool of the Council, Ambassador. That is what the Draeth have been for 12,000 years. Tools do not choose who uses them." The channel closed. I sat with that conversation for a long time. Then I pushed it aside, because the Council was not done. The sabotage came the next day. A falsified communication was broadcast across every channel on Conclave Station, allegedly from Earth's government, stating that Ambassador Dominic Hale had been recalled and his actions disavowed. The broadcast used formatting consistent with official United Diplomatic Corps transmissions. It included details that only someone with access to human communication protocols could have fabricated. The effect was immediate. 3 species that had been on the verge of joining the coalition withdrew. The Makuran representative demanded verification. Even Saval looked shaken. I moved fast. I arranged a live, verified transmission from Earth, using authentication codes that the Council could not have duplicated because they had been changed after my departure from Earth as a security precaution. The Secretary General himself appeared on screen, confirmed my mandate in clear and unambiguous terms, and addressed the Council directly. "Humanity stands behind Ambassador Hale. His authority is absolute, his mission is unchanged, and any further attempts to undermine his position through fabricated communications will be regarded as an act of hostility against Earth." The coalition stabilized, barely, but barely was enough. That night, I gathered the coalition representatives in Saval's hidden chamber and proposed the thing that had been forming in my mind since the moment I first read the data chip. Not renegotiation of the Ascension treaties, nullification. Every willing species would simultaneously declare their Ascension treaty void on the grounds of systemic fraud. Not amended, not revised, void. A legal reset to the state that existed before they signed, which for most of these species was a state of independent sovereignty that they had not exercised in millennia. The room went quiet in a way that told me they understood exactly what I was suggesting and exactly how dangerous it was. "If we do this and not enough species join," the Mokuran representative said, "the Council will crush us individually. They have done it before. Small species that caused problems have a tendency to experience internal difficulties that conveniently lead to regime changes and renewed compliance." "You are right," I said. "If we do this halfway, we lose everything. That is why we cannot do it halfway. We need enough voices saying the same word at the same time that enforcement becomes impossible. The Council has 400 member species. If 40 stand together, the Draethith cannot engage them all simultaneously without destroying the very order they are supposed to protect." "And what word would that be?" Saval asked. "The same word I said in that chamber on the first day. No. Tessara Vone left Conclave Station that night, traveling on a Rithon transport that Saval's network had arranged. She carried with her the access codes to the Tessic archives and a timeline that gave her 72 hours to retrieve the original treaties and transmit them back to the station. 72 hours, 3 days. That was how long the coalition had to hold together before the evidence became undeniable. I stood at the viewport and watched Tessara's transport disappear into the dark between stars, and tried to calculate the odds that everything I had set in motion would work. The odds were not good, but they were better than the odds of signing a treaty designed to erase us. Tessara Vone succeeded. I did not learn the details until later, how she had talked her way past a council monitoring post by claiming she was returning home due to illness, how she had accessed the Tessic archives through a series of physical security protocols that had not been updated in 400 years because no one had ever imagined a Tessic archivist would have reason to breach them, how she had worked for 18 straight hours copying and encrypting 300 original Ascension treaties while Council investigators were already beginning to ask questions about her departure from Conclave Station. What I learned in the moment, what I experienced in real time, was the notification on my terminal at 4 in the morning station time that a massive encrypted data package was incoming through Saval's covert relay network. 300 treaties, 12,000 years of evidence, every single one showing the same architecture of sovereign surrender that I had demonstrated with my sample of 12. I did not sleep. I spent the remaining hours before dawn formatting the data into a distribution package that could be sent to every delegation on Conclave Station simultaneously. Saval's people helped. The Mokuran representative, who turned out to have a background in information warfare that his species had been prohibited from practicing since their disarmament, built an encryption-breaking protocol that would force the data through the Council's communication filters, whether they tried to block it or not. At dawn, we sent it. 300 original Ascension treaties, unredacted and annotated, delivered to every single delegation on Conclave Station. Every species in the Council received their own treaty alongside dozens of others, each one demonstrating the same systematic pattern. The concessions they had been proud of winning, the compromises they had celebrated as evidence of their diplomatic skill, all of it pre-written, all of it identical, all of it designed to produce the same outcome regardless of who was sitting at the table. The reaction was not immediate. It built. Like a wave forming far offshore, the first sign was a deep, subsurface tremor that you could feel but not see. Delegations went dark, pulling their representatives into closed sessions to review the documents. The station's communication network, which was designed to handle the routine traffic of 400 bureaucracies, began straining under the load of species frantically cross-referencing their treaties against each other. Then the Tessic delegation released a public statement. They confirmed the authenticity of the archives. They confirmed that the documents had been maintained in their original form for millennia, and they confirmed that the evidence supported what the human ambassador had claimed from the beginning. The Ascension system was, and had always been, a mechanism of control disguised as an invitation. I requested an audience before the full council. This time, the High Arbiter did not grant it willingly. A formal petition from 37 species, led by the Rathan and the Mokuran, forced the session. Siolan Ket had no procedural grounds to refuse, and for the first time in his long tenure, he was operating without the comfortable certainty that the system would protect him. I walked into the chamber for the final time. The atmosphere was nothing like my first visit. No ceremony, no spectacle. The delegations were clustered in tight, agitated groups. Conversations stopped as I passed. I could feel the weight of 400 civilizations reassessing everything they believed about the order they lived in. And for some of them, the reassessment was not going well. Anger radiated from certain sections of the chamber. Fear from others. And from a growing number of delegations, something that looked remarkably like resolve. I stepped to the podium. Behind me, representatives of 37 species rose from their seats. The Rathan, the Mokuran, the Tessic. A dozen smaller species whose names I had learned over the past week, and whose courage in this moment was greater than anything I had demonstrated, because they had more to lose. They were already inside the system. They were risking everything they had been given, everything they had been allowed to keep, on the belief that what they had been given was not a gift but a lease. I did not make a speech. I read a document. Joint Declaration of Sovereign Nullification, I said, and the words carried across the chamber with a clarity that surprised even me. We, the undersigned species, acting in the full exercise of our sovereign authority as independent civilizations, hereby declare our respective Ascension treaties to be null and void. We base this declaration on the following finding of fact, that the Ascension treaties presented to our civilizations were not the products of genuine negotiation, but the implementation of a predetermined outcome designed to systematically transfer sovereign authority from signatory species to the Galactic Council and its administrative bodies. I continued reading. Each clause was precise. Each finding of fact was supported by specific citations from the original treaties. The legal framework was airtight, because the Tessic elder who had helped draft it had 6,000 years of legal tradition behind her, and she had not made errors. When I finished, the chamber was silent in a way I had never experienced, not the silence of shock, which I had caused before. This was the silence of a fundamental shift, the silence of a structure that had just heard its foundations crack. The High Arbiter spoke, and for the first time, his voice sounded old. "This declaration is without legal standing," Ket said. "The Ascension Treaties are binding instruments ratified by the sovereign governments of each signatory species. Unilateral nullification is not recognized under any provision of galactic law." "The treaties were obtained through fraud," I said. "Fraud voids consent. Without consent, there is no binding instrument. This is not a principle unique to galactic law, Arbiter. It is a principle inherent in the concept of law itself." "You are not a member of this council," Ket said, and the sharpness in his voice was no longer diplomatic. It was raw. "You have no standing to lecture this body on principles of law." "Then listen to those who do," I said, and I stepped aside. Tessara Vone walked to the podium. Behind her, the senior representatives of 36 other species stood in solidarity. Each one spoke their species' name and confirmed their support for the declaration. It took 11 minutes. 11 minutes of voices from across the galaxy, some of them shaking, some of them steady, all of them saying the same thing. "We void our treaties. We reclaim our sovereignty. We refuse." The High Arbiter's response was to invoke Council Security Protocol 7, an emergency authorization for the use of military force to preserve galactic order. The authorization was directed at the Dryeth battle groups that had been positioned near Conclave Station for the past week. The order was clear. Blockade the station. Prevent any signatory of the nullification declaration from leaving. Detain the human delegation by force if necessary. I stood at the podium and watched through the chamber's panoramic viewports as 14 Dryeth warships began to move. They were enormous, each one a crescent of dark metal bristling with weapons systems that could reduce a planet's surface to glass. They pivoted toward the station with the slow, inevitable precision of predators that had never needed to rush. For 60 seconds, I genuinely believed it was over. That the force which had maintained the Council's order for 12,000 years would do what it had always done. That the system was too old, too entrenched, too powerful, to be broken by 37 voices and a human who had said no. Then one of the Dryeth warships stopped. It did not just slow down. It stopped completely, holding position between the advancing battle group and Conclave Station. Its running lights shifted from the standard Dryeth military pattern to something my database did not recognize, and for a moment, I had no idea what was happening. A communication channel opened, not to the Council, not to the High Arbiter, to the entire assembly. Every delegation on the station heard what came next. "This is Fleet Commander Gran Torvek, of the Dryeth hegemony vessel Ironbound." His voice was the same gravel-on-metal sound I remembered from our private conversations, but there was something different in it now. Something I could only describe as the sound of a being choosing to be something other than what he had been made to be. "I have reviewed the Tessic archives. The evidence is authentic. The Dryeth were the first species subjected to the Ascension system. We were reshaped to serve as its enforcement mechanism. Our military culture, our role as the Council's armed force, our entire civilizational identity was engineered. We were the prototype." He paused. The chamber was so quiet I could hear the hum of the station's life support systems. "I will not fire on beings for the offense of learning what my own species was never allowed to remember. Ironbound is standing down." One ship, then 2, then 5. Dryeth captains, one after another, breaking formation and holding position. Not all of them. The battle group did not unanimously defect. Several warships continued to advance, their commanders loyal to the chain of command that had defined the Dryeth for millennia. But enough ships stopped. Enough captains chose to stand between the Council's order and the station full of species that were trying to wake up. The military arm of the Galactic Council fractured in real time, and every being in that chamber watched it happen. The High Arbiter made one final attempt. He approached me at the podium, while the chamber dissolved into a chaos of competing voices, arguing delegations, and the visible spectacle of Dreyeth warships facing each other in the void outside. "Ambassador Hale," Siolun Ket said, and his voice was low enough that only I could hear it over the noise. "I am prepared to offer humanity a separate agreement. Full sovereignty, unrestricted military development, territorial expansion rights without council oversight, trade access on preferential terms. Everything your species wants, granted immediately and without conditions." I looked at him. For the first time, I saw past the centuries of practiced authority and the scales gone gray with age. I saw desperation, real, unfiltered desperation. "And the other species?" I asked. "The 37 who stood with us? The ones who trusted us when we told them there was another way. They would return to the existing framework, modified perhaps, improved, but the system would continue. It was everything Earth had wanted when it sent me here. Full access to galactic civilization with none of the hidden costs, the smart play, the rational play. The play that any species acting in pure self-interest would take without hesitation." "No," I said. Siolun Ket stared at me. "You would sacrifice your species' advantage for the sake of civilizations you have known for less than a week? Humanity did not come to the stars to be the one species that got a better cage," I said. "We came to tear the cages down." He held my gaze for a long moment. Then the High Arbiter of the Galactic Council, the being who had presided over the Ascension system for longer than most civilizations on that station had existed, turned and walked away from the podium without another word. The session did not end with a vote. It did not end with a resolution or a formal declaration. It ended with the High Arbiter leaving the chamber, and the systems of control that had operated for 12,000 years leaving with him. Not in a dramatic collapse, not in a single moment of revolution, but in the quiet, devastating realization, shared by every being in that chamber, that the architecture of galactic civilization had been built on a lie, and the lie had been spoken aloud, and it could not be unspoken. The days that followed were messy. There is no clean ending to 12 millennia of institutional deception. The coalition grew to 93 species within a week, then stalled as older, more established civilizations grappled with the implications of what sovereignty actually meant when you had not exercised it in thousands of years. Idbraith splintered into factions, some embracing the revelation of their engineered history, and others rejecting it violently. 3 minor conflicts erupted in the outer systems before mediators could intervene. But they were mediators, not enforcers. That distinction mattered more than anything else. I returned to the Carthage on a morning that felt no different from any other. Commander Beckett met me at the airlock with the same crossed arms and tight jaw she had worn when I left. "You look like you survived a war," she said. "I survived a negotiation," I said, "which, depending on who you ask, is worse." We departed Conclave Station through an approach corridor that was no longer guarded by Dreyeth warships. The station hung in the void behind us, still enormous, still ancient, still the seat of something. But what that something was, and what it would become, was now an open question for the first time in 12,000 years. I stood at the viewport and watched it shrink. I thought about Saval, who had risked everything to press a data chip into a stranger's hand. I thought about Tessara Vone, who had walked into an archive she had spent her life protecting and dismantled its secrets. I thought about Gran Torvek, who had looked at the truth of what his species had been made into and chosen to be something else. And I thought about that first morning in the council chamber. 400 species watching me, with the patient confidence of beings who knew exactly how the story ended, because it always ended the same way. It did not end that way. It ended with a word, the simplest word in any language, 2 letters, 1 syllable. A word so small that a 12,000-year-old system built by beings of immense intelligence and patience had never thought to prepare a defense against it. Number. Humanity's greatest contribution to galactic civilization was not our technology, which was primitive by the standards of species who had been building starships since before we had written language. It was not our military, which was a fraction of the size of the forces arrayed against us. It was not our diplomacy, which by any objective standard was reckless, improvised, and performed without adequate preparation. It was the stubborn, irrational, entirely unreasonable refusal to accept a bad deal, just because everyone else already had. The galaxy was not fixed. It was broken in ways that would take decades to repair, and might never be fully resolved. Old powers do not surrender quietly, and new freedoms are not easily exercised by species that have spent millennia forgetting what freedom meant. But for the first time in 12,000 years, 400 civilizations were talking to each other as equals, not as ascended and unascended, not as elder and junior, not as the architects of a system and the species that system was designed to consume, as equals. With all the difficulty and disagreement and glorious, exhausting chaos that equality brings. Because one human, standing in a room full of ancient powers, had said the one word none of them had ever heard. And the galaxy had never been the same since.